Welcome back. It has been a long time since I've posted a Pat Talks Law, but this is something I feel like I need to be addressing. And this post is relative to the current troubles in LA and the expanding protests as a result of that. President Trump has federalized portions of the California National Guard and deployed them, along with deploying Marines into LA. Now, the National Guard is detaining protesters for later arrest by federal agents. There is an issue with that. And what I'm saying, and the reason I say that is because a detention becomes an arrest after a very short period. If a detention is prolonged or excessive force is used, it can become an arrest. And we can go into that. A detention is mainly a temporary stop where law enforcement has a reasonable suspicion. However, and an arrest is the formal action where they take somebody into custody with the intent of charging them with a crime. Now, there is the whole question of whether or not the National Guard is acting as an agent of law enforcement when they are detaining a protester. And I'm very sorry, I'm going to mute my phone. Maybe. So, whether or not they're acting as an agent of law enforcement. If they are acting as an agent of law enforcement, then they may be falling under and may be violating the Posse Comitatus Act. So, let's address that, okay? And first, President Trump federalized the California National Guard and directed its members to detain protesters for subsequent arrest by federal agents. Okay, is the use of federalized guardsmen in compliance with the PCA? And that limits the involvement of federal military forces in civil law enforcement. You can look up for more information United States v. Dreyer, 804 F3D at 1266. So the Posse Comitatus Act prohibits the Army Air Force and now all branches of military and armed services except the Coast Guard from executing laws unless expressly authorized by the Constitution or an act of Congress. Okay, the PCA applies to National Guard members only when they are in federal service. When acting in a state capacity, the PCA does not apply to the National Guard. The federalization of the National Guard, when the President federalizes the National Guard, it transitions to federal service and becomes subject to the PCA. Now, the PCA allows for exceptions, such as where the use of federal troops is expressly authorized by the Constitution or an act of Congress. It restricts federal military forces, including the National Guard, from participating in civilian law enforcement activities, such as detaining individuals unless explicitly authorized by the Constitution or an act of Congress. This is a problem for the President. Now, the federalization of the California National Guard by the President places the Guard under federal service, making it subject to the PCA. The PCA explicitly prohibits the use of federal military forces, including the federalized National Guard units, in civilian law enforcement activities, such as detaining protesters, unless an exception applies. Now, the exceptions are limited to circumstances expressly authorized by the Constitution or Act of Congress. In this case, some exceptions that may be relevant actually would be if the President invoked the Insurrection Act. Okay? At the moment, the President has not. Okay? They can enforce federal laws, enforce federal laws when unlawful obstructions make it impractical to enforce laws through judicial means. Under the Insurrection Act, 10 U.S.C. Section 253, to suppress insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combinations, or conspiracies if they hinder the execution of federal or state law and deprive people of rights secured by the Constitution. Presidents have used this authority in the past, and sparingly. For example, in 1957, Little Rock desegregation crisis, Brown v. Board of Education, Governor stood outside and said, no, you're not bringing black kids into the school. And the president said, yes, we are, and sent the military to ensure it happened. And in 1992, again in LA, the LA riots. So if President Trump invoked the Insurrection Act, and if the legal threshold for domestic violence or unlawful obstruction is met, then the use of federalized guard troops to detain protesters could be legally justified under the statute. Now, there are still constitutional limits. The detentions still must comply with the Fourth Amendment. Reasonable suspicion, probable cause, they have to be appropriately arrested. They can't use excessive force. The military cannot operate as de facto police without a strong justification. The use of the Insurrection Act is, of course, very sensitive politically and will absolutely be challenged in court if the president invokes it, especially regarding whether statutory standards met, whether peaceful protesters are being targeted, and whether the state authorities, Governor Newsom, opposes federalization. So the separation of powers and federalism concerns. If federal intervention overrules state opposition, the courts may scrutinize that for overreach, and that may happen down the road. It's not going to change the fact of the troops on the street today. In Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company v. Sawyer, the Supreme Court cautioned against executive action that lacked congressional support or contradicts legislative interests. So, getting back to the PCA, the courts have consistently interpreted the PCA to restrict the direct active use of federal troops in civilian law enforcement, emphasizing the need for explicit legal authorization. Furthermore, the administrative interpretations confirm that PCA applies to National Guard only when it has been federalized. The detention of protesters by federalized guardsmen would constitute direct involvement in civilian law enforcement, which is prohibited under the PCA unless specifically authorized. Now, the Posse Comitatus Act applies to the California National Guard when federalized by President Trump, prohibiting its use in civilian law enforcement activities, such as detaining protesters, unless authorized by a Constitution or Act of Congress. Not aware of any such authorization that has been issued by Congress or that the President has invoked the Insurrection Act, which makes every detention that has been done by the California National Guard may open up the guardsmen, the officers, up through the general, and possibly even the president, to the penalties of up to 2 years in jail for violating the Posse Comitatus Act. So this is a serious thing. Now, ironically, while the military can't act in a law enforcement capacity, when you have protesters waving the flag of a foreign government and attacking the United States military with arms, I don't believe that can be called an insurrection. It could, however, be called an invasion, and is most definitely an enemy force at taking up arms against the United States military in our own country. There is only one reasonable, logical, and honest answer to that, and it is not detaining the protesters. If the United States military, if the U.S. Marines are attacked by people with Molotov cocktails and rocks that place any Marine in deadly hazard, the only response is to let the Marines do what they do best. That said, President Trump, the Department of Defense, have not taken the gloves off. And that is confusing and unfortunate, because in doing so, they have exposed themselves to violations of Posse Comitatus. It is not an easy answer, and it definitely requires more evaluation than 10 minutes on YouTube. So please feel free, look it up. Look up Posse Comitatus. look up the restrictions and understand that a detention for the purpose of later arrest is an arrest. And I guess the final point that I should make is I am a career defense attorney. I also happen to be a Republican, and I support President Trump's agenda immensely. But this line, this is too far. And it's not right. American troops cannot detain American citizens without direct authorization. Now, the American troops can stand right next to a federal agent. And when the federal agent detains that person, they can assist. Or if the federal agent places that person under arrest, they can assist the federal agent. But they can't do it on their own call. Good luck out there. It's getting scary.